My name is Andrew Ahn Westover, and I'm the Key Pairing Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I'm glad to welcome you to this evening's program, Meeting Worlds, on Okwui and Enwezors' work. This program is presented in conjunction with our upcoming exhibition, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. We are honored to welcome directors, curators, and scholars from across the globe for this conversation. Convenings like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members, Andrea Calderes and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum digital initiatives are generously supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. Before we begin, one update about tonight's panel. Unfortunately, due to last-minute corona-related travel interruptions, Octavio Zaya will be unable to join the program. I will now share brief biographical notes about each panelist speaking this evening. Uta Meta-Bauer is a curator and, since 2013, has been the founding director of NTU Center for Contemporary Art Singapore and a professor in the School of Art, Media, and Design. Prior, she was Associate Professor, School of Architecture and Planning at MIT Cambridge, and founding director of the MIT program in Art, Culture, and Technology. She was a co-curator of Documenta 11 on the team of Okwui and Enwezors, and the artistic director of the Third Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art. In 2015, she co-curated with MIT List Center for Visual Art director Paul Ha the US pavilion of the 56th Venice Biennale, featuring video and performance pioneer Joan Jonas, who received honorary mention for the Best National Pavilion by the Biennale's international jury. She was the expedition leader of TBA 21, Academy the Current, exploring the Pacific Archipelago and littorals that are most impacted by climate change and human interventions. Franklin Sermons has been the director of the Perez Art Museum Miami since fall 2015. Since coming to PAM, he has overseen the acquisition of more than 1,000 works of art by donation or purchase. At PAM, Sermons has pursued his vision of PAM as the People's Museum, representing a Miami lens by strengthening existing affiliate groups such as the PAM Fund for African American Art and creating the International Women's Committee and the Latin American and Latinx Art Fund. Sermons organized several shows, and prior to his appointment, he was the department head and curator of contemporary art at Los Angeles County Museum of Art from 2010 until 2015. From 2006 to 2010, he was curator of modern and contemporary art at the Menil Collection in Houston. From 2005 to 2006, Sermons was curatorial advisory committee member at MoMA PS1. He was the artistic director of Prospect 3, New Orleans from 2012 until 2014, and in 2007 was awarded the David C. Driscoll Prize, administered by the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. Terry Smith is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Contemporary Art History and Theory, Department of History of Art and Architecture, University of Pittsburgh, professor in the Division of Philosophy, Art, and Critical Thought at the European Graduate School, and lecturer at large, Curatorial Studies Program, School of Visual Arts, New York. In 2010, he became Australia Council Visual Arts Laureate and received the Franklin Jewett Mather Award from the College Art Association. With Okwui and Enwezors and Nancy Condi, he was editor of the Antinomies of Art and Culture, Modernity, Postmodernity, and Contemporaneity. Smith is the author of many books, including What is Contemporary Art?, Contemporary Art World Currents, Thinking Curating, Talking Contemporary Curating, The Contemporary Composition, 1 in 5 Ideas on Conceptual Art and Conceptualism, and Art to Come, Histories of Contemporary Art. And now, a few logistical notes before we begin. This program will last for a little bit over an hour. If time allows, we will have a brief Q&A at the end. If at any point during the conversation you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function by clicking the Q&A button, located at the bottom of your screen, to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. If there is time, our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about our upcoming public programs and our full suite of exclusive digital content on our website, newmuseum.org. Now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to Edlis Neeson, Artistic Director, and our program moderator, Massimiliano Gioni.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, for the wonderful introduction. It's always a tough act to follow. And I want to say good evening to everybody and good morning to our friends in Singapore and in Sydney. I think it is really a testimony to Okwi's ability to bring people together from different time zones with different accents and different languages, that we have this opportunity tonight to speak with three friends and collaborators of Okwi's about his work. I'll just say a few words about the exhibition that we are organizing at the New Museum, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, which will open on February 16th. So in a few days, we are installing it. And it's an exhibition that Okwui had conceived and started working on in 2018. At the time, he was contributing to two catalogs for the New Museum, namely our John Aconfra survey and our Nari Ward retrospective. And around that time, we were talking frequently, and he told me he was working on a series of lectures for Harvard titled Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, which would focus on what Okwui described as the crystallization of Black grief in America in the middle of the emergency of Black grief that we had witnessed in the last few years, particularly under the Trump administration. Sadly, Okwui was unable to complete the exhibition. As you know, he died in March 2019. Before his passing, he had invited Glenn Ligon to be, as he described it to me, an interlocutor on the exhibition. And at the time of Okwi's passing, after consulting with Glenn, after consulting with friends and collaborators and Okwi's estate, we together decided to complete this project, which Okwui had really pushed quite forward and had nearly completed himself. And so following the blueprints that he left us, following the artist list that he left us, and the list of contributors to the catalog, we, with the help of a curatorial committee composed by Glenn Ligon, Naomi Beckwith, and Mark Nash, we completed the exhibition. Actually, we'll have other opportunities to give a little more background about how the exhibition was completed and how much Okwui had already prepared himself. But so tonight is a sort of preparatory conversation in anticipation for the exhibition. And so before talking about the exhibition itself, we thought it was important to look back at Okwi's work and to talk to some of his collaborators, some of his friends, to learn a little more about his exceptional contribution to the history of art. So tonight we have three great contributors to this conversation, and I will just shut up and invite them to take the floor and take the mic, starting with Franklin Searmans. And I want to start by asking each of you how you met Okwui, and what is your first memory of him, and both as an individual, as a person, as a friend, and also as a curator and art historian.
Thank you, Max. Good to be here. Good to be speaking of Okwui tonight and with these esteemed colleagues. I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank Lisa and the New Museum, everybody there, and Andrew on Westover and his education team. Much appreciated. And I was supposed to have Octavio here kicking us off this evening, but in mercurial fashion, he's not here. So I will begin, and I wanted to just begin with a clip. I think you have that, Tara. Thank you. Just wanted to start there, and as some might say, ashe, or amen. Um, I met Okwui in the beginning of summer 1995 at Dia Center for the Arts, where I was the publications assistant. And I think it's worth mentioning, after the clarity of thought that went into the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which gave us a view of pluralism, to say the least, that would greatly inform Okwi's work. That spring, the Whitney presented us with a somewhat ascetic show, to say the least, one in which race, gender, and sexual orientation took a much more reserved place than that of the 1993 Whitney Biennial. And I cite these things and placing my New York centrism to this conversation, because that is where this conversation begins for me. At DIA, Center for the Arts, running concurrently in that period, was the exhibition Worlds Envisioned, Alighiero e Boetti and Frederic Bruley-Boabre. A gorgeous exhibition done by Lynn Cook, and important in this moment because Okwui wrote about this show in the summer issue of his journal Enka. And I think that was only the second issue of the journal, which was founded in the winter of '94. The featured artist on the cover of that issue was Ouattara, an artist that I think many of us are still grappling with, but an incredible artist in his own right. Okwui decided that he wouldn't write of the full exhibition. He decided that he would write only of Bruley-Boabre, and the lesser known of the two artists in certain NYC art circles, and certainly in international art circles. But of course, in others, Boetti might have been the lesser known. And I think Okwui was hip to that. Through a beautiful kind of dialogue between these two artist friends, the show still is impossible to escape the thought in that moment, perhaps, of a revival of earlier juxtapositions of primitive / modern, as espoused in many of the shows that Okwui wrestled with, especially like Magicien de la Terre. So he wrote this incredible piece in the journal and really sort of drew out a lot of the comparisons and contrasts to a form of reception for this artist from the Ivory Coast who had not had that degree of exposure, at least in New York, and especially not in the people who were reading Enka at that time. I think an explosion of kind of activity for him grew from writing, obviously, and we'll get to that. The journal was clearly a vehicle for the sharing of ideas that the exhibitions were just beginning to illustrate. Of course, we'll talk about shows, but Insight, being organized at the Guggenheim in 1996, is obviously a signpost here and a big part of the conversations that were generated out of Enka. And I also just, I needed this prompt and time to kind of reconvene with Okwui and his work, and can't wait to see the exhibition some way, somehow. The prescience of this show is not lost on anyone. And had it opened on time in the fall, it would have been just as prescient and thought-provoking in the context of that immediate present. That contemporaneity is a moving target, constantly shifting. Evolving is something that Okwui was greatly concerned with, and something that Terry and Okwui and Nancy Condi explored thoroughly in the 2008 publication, Antinomies of Art and Culture, Modernity, Postmodernity, Contemporaneity. Now that the first white president, of course not my words, but Ta-Nehisi Coates' title to his wonderful essay in the new exhibition catalog, has left the White House even more ignominiously on the heels of the insurrection he fomented than even a Black person perhaps could have imagined, this exhibition, opening in about a month's time, will be clearly prophetic, yet thoroughly ensconced in the present. Having read Okwi's introductory paragraph for his essay on grief and grievance, art and mourning in America, the vision to confront the political and social moment from the vantage point of the very recent past was part and parcel of his work since the beginning. He did not believe in the power of art without a political component. In the first paragraph of his brief on the show, he places us late in October 2016 as the American presidential race is coming to a close. And he paints a picture of one of those moments seized upon by the now former president to display how much faith he has placed in white supremacy. For he has called for a rally at the Gettysburg Memorial, where Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, 153 years earlier, had dedicated the site as a national monument to the rupture and repair of this country in the wake of civil war. And that is the balancing act that Okwui walked so well. As a poet and as a writer first, he brought this kind of thinking to bear upon the whole of curatorial interventions and exhibition making. Yet art for art's sake is something we have never been afforded or interested in. Life is too short. Art has been and must be and always will be in service to something grander and more humane than art for art's sake. Okwui got that. And so when you read the first intro paragraph to his words on this show, it has absolutely nothing to do with an art object. It has everything to do with life and death. And because his work was so innovative and strong, we are here today. And we'll be talking about that work for a considerable time to come. The other thing that I think is important to recognize is the presence of joy in some tough and difficult conversations and even treatises on art and ideas, thus wanting to give us a peek at the clip of Alicia Hall and Jason Moran performing at Venice, the Biennale in 2015, where they were a significant part of the curatorial conceit to use this physical center of the space of that exhibition and dedicate it to performance and dedicate it to a sense of dynamism that is not necessarily a part of other aspects of the show, but he placed that at the center. And I think that show, not unlike the 1997 Johannesburg Biennale, placed Black joy as a centrifugal force amongst others in a worldly exhibition on art and life. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Franklin. Before I actually pass on the word, I think, to Ute, I wanted to ask you something. You mentioned your encounter in 1995 in New York, and you mentioned also that Whitney Biennale. Interestingly enough, Okwui invited Nari Ward to recreate his piece from the 1995 Whitney Biennale, which had gone lost or destroyed. And so that is actually a central piece in the upcoming exhibition. And I think it was particularly interested in the way in which that particular piece somehow jarred with the rest of that biennale. But what I want to ask you is, Okwui in 95 had been in New York for something like 13 years at that point, but he had always being both a New Yorker and obviously a very cosmopolitan international figure. I was very moved when, in the last few days, I asked him, I needed his address for a grant application, and he gave me his New York address, even though he was in Munich. So clearly New York was his home. But I want to ask you, how do you feel he lived his being a New Yorker or being more of an international figure in the 90s? In an interview we did, he spoke about how he didn't feel entirely belonging, in a sense, to New York or to American culture, and how that even gave him a freedom to bypass certain problems and reductions of his personality or his being.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Max. I mean, I think it gave him a freedom. It also gave him a distancing from certain aspects of life in New York that was contributed to a much more global view. And kind of from the very first iterations, even when you see NK and you see the work that the journal is promoting and presenting and talking about, there's never the sense that this is a New York publication that is concerned with that and that alone. It was worldly from the beginning. And I think, we can see some of that in personal experience. And the fact that he grew up as a child in Nigeria is something that was always a consistent part from the very beginning. It's also the kind of thing that allows you to go in and out of different spaces, as we know so well. It was nothing to see Okwui in Austria, or to see Okwui in Asia. I mean, that was the terrain that we were talking about. And like you mentioned, as we begin, Uta has been all over the place. She's in Singapore now. Terry's in Sydney right now. And, you know, that sense of global at a time when still that was not the norm or the accepted trajectory was absolutely remarkable. And it's the kind of thing that allows you to bring in a group of artists, as in the case of Insight, that are coming from so far away in terms of the context of the Guggenheim. And we've been talking about that a lot recently. I'd say that some of the changes that we've seen in the last week with Naomi coming on, Naomi Beckwith now taking over the reins of the curatorial team there as deputy director, is part and parcel coming out of a conversation that goes back to Insight. So much of that kind of, you know, the ability to walk through different spaces. I mean, come on, we all deal with a certain level of masking and double consciousness, but I think that Okwui was able to use that in a very consistent and interesting way. At the same time, you have 96 Guggenheim, you also have him working at Johannesburg, literally at the same moment, for the exhibition that opens in 1997. I could go on.
Well, let's hear from Ute. When did you meet Okwui the first time?
Yeah, I met Okwui actually first time physically, and he had a physical presence, I have to say, and a very physical love in Arco in Madrid. But I quickly want to really also thank you guys for having me, although the distances. And I just really want to thank at this moment also Lisa Phillips and Karen Wong, because literally a year ago, we were working on Idea City, Singapore, together with the New Museum for our annual festival. And we were counting daily COVID cases in Singapore. And Lisa was very concerned about the participants. And I'm really very saddened to see what's happening in the US right now. So I really wish you all the best, because we feel now quite safe here. Yeah, and also Massimiliano, thank you so much for including me, because the range of Okwi's collaborators and friends is endless. It's quite stunning, the network that he had. So we would meet actually at Arco, which at this days, like in the mid-90s or so, it opened up after Franco period, and the fair actually stunningly, Rosina Gombias-Baez, as a director of the fair, would have these panels which brought in usually in February about 100 curators indeed from around the world, which was also quite new. Latin American curators, curators from Africa, curators from Asia. That did not happen at the time. And so many of us met, and we also would running this agency called VOTI. So, and I think, yeah, this was the context. And then I met Okwui again in a conference where we did not have necessarily a friendly encounter. We would always battle on feminism, on racism. And but I was very stunned. Then he invited me once, 1998. I remember that shortly. Actually, it was 1998, I think, or 1999 in February in an elevator. And he said, I have to talk to you in the hotel down. I said, like, oh God, what could have happened? And then I said, can we sit down for coffee? And then he said, yeah, I wanted to invite you. You want to be part of the Documenta team? I hadn't met him more in depth. He knew what I'm doing, but I don't know where he took the trust. And so maybe if we can go to the slides, Derek, is like, yeah, he got appointed when he was 35 to become the artistic director of Documenta, which was quite stunning and all over the press. It was written, the first non-European artistic director of Documenta, which made Okwui terribly furious always, because he said, I'm not a non-European, I'm actually an African. I'm the first African curator of Documenta. And if you go to next slide, I mean, you see how young he was, but to the surprise of Documenta, I think already like a month later, he told him, "This is my team." So he must have thought about this already before in the running up of this. And as you see, it's composed of old friends, like, I mean, Octavio Saya, Carlos Basualto were one of his peers in New York and his sparring partners. And he did his first show, also bigger show in the Guggenheim on photography, together with actually Carlos and with Octavio Saya. And also he worked very closely with Mark Nash already in that time on the Short Century, African independence movements, which is another very important show. So he got together peers, but also Sarat Maharaj was for him very important in terms of shifting the record on education and discussing post-colonialism. And then Susan Guess, his trusted friend, and for him a mentor in the field of curating. And he really appreciated her long time as being a producer in the Renaissance Society and never really shifting to big museums, although she could, but being a sturdy, close alliance to the artist who she usually commissioned to make a new work for the Renaissance. So he wanted her clearly also as a producer. And one has to say, like can we go to the next slide? He embarked immediately again of a grander narrative, not only a big team, but also a very big agenda. And I just also want to come back to what Franklin said. Okwui had studied political science as a background, and he came out of poetry when he arrived in the United States, and curating was a much later kind of add-on. So he always wanted to have a team around to bounce the ideas and to look into that. Although I have to say he has an incredible sense of how work should be placed and juxtaposed. And I think Terry will talk about that more later. But as you see here, he immediately decentralized Documenta. He said it in space and time. We started 18 months prior on Democracy Unrealized in Vienna, that then continued in Berlin. It started at my school. He wanted to start it as a place where artists generated in art schools, but also at a place of democracy. He saw Vienna, where the Second Republic was brought in an international convention, also as a political place. Berlin, the same, the city that was like working then on its getting together after a division after World War II. So Okwui never separated politics from curatorial narratives. He said art is not separate from the politic of the day. And one has to look back, if we look art historically back to work, we have to look at the place of origin and the political context, the social conditions of that very place. And you see, we moved from Democracy Unrealized to Experiments with Truth in New Delhi, and the preparation for Experiments with Truth actually started in The Hague at the war tribunals. He didn't want to have us separate from discussion, so we were following then the tribunals on the war in Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, and also already Rwanda. The court was formed in Tanzania to address the genocide in Rwanda. So this was the context where we would discuss the platform and like the speakers. It continued then with Creativity, Realization, St. Lucia in the Caribbean, also where one of the participating artists, Isaac Julian, is from. And then we concluded Under Siege for African Cities in Okwi's native country, Nigeria, and it took place in Lagos. And then only it culminated in the exhibition Platform 5 in Casson. And he had more, can we go to next slide? Derek, can you move to the next slide? And then to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, you see already the ambition. So the speakers, more than 100 speakers, they were really coming out of politics, human rights issues. I mean, like artists were included, filmmakers, policymakers. He really wanted to set the tone right for the discourse, the black box, as he called it, to set the tone for Documenta, to set the tone for the discourses, but also located them at places of its origin, where he thinks the right discussions would be. And you see here an economist of Beijing, Sichuan Chui, but also Hole Swinka, the Nobel Literature Laureate from Nigeria, at the opening in Berlin for Democracy Unrealized. And next slide. Yeah, in Johannesburg, in Lagos, we discussed Freetown, Johannesburg, Kinshasa, and Lagos in the aftermath of independence, and how did these narratives unfold at each place. So it was not necessarily about art, but the artist embedded in these histories. And as you see, I mean, like the context was different. And next slide. You would see Okwui in the middle of these discussions. He wanted to discuss it with his also African peers and fellows. And it was very critical for him because all of these discussions also on a post-independence period in Africa would usually happen in the former colonies, in Paris or like in London and so, but he said to get together on African soil was very crucial for him. And yeah, so that was also, he wanted to bring the discourse to those places and also acknowledge and respect where these discourses have embarked from. Next slide. Yeah, this platform 5, finally, we are in Casson, Friedrichsjanum. He enjoyed tremendously the crowds. I mean, like Okwui loved crowds. He loved to discuss it with the audience. So during the 100 days of Documenta exhibition platform 5 in Casson, I was staying with him in Kassel during the whole time. And we would have daily walks. He only left for a few days once when his daughter, Uchenna, like went through some schooling or so, like, so he wanted to be back, but otherwise he was there the whole 100 days, and daily we made walks through Documenta. He talked with the normal audience, greeted them, shaked hands, wanted to hear what they think. And so, and also in the way to Documenta, he lived in Kassel and he was very beloved there because he was in the middle of the people, like picking up food, finding a Nigerian hairdresser. So he did live actually there and he enjoyed it, and he immersed himself in talking with the people also of Kassel, of his grand narrative that he wanted to unfold there. Next slide. Yeah, the entrance, the heart of Documenta, is always Museum Friedrichsjanum, which is the first built museum in Europe dedicated to become a museum. And the entrances, like in the Friedrichsjanum, was dedicated to female artists without saying it. Haneda Boven had the whole spine. You saw here in the center, it was Cheré Face-Chu, the late Iranian artist who couldn't been exhibited in earlier Documentas, although Catherine already attempted that. Then we had there Doris Salgado, we had like, it was unfolding, Sarina Bimshi. So he wanted to give a grand narrative, an opening to female artists from different parts of the world and really give them the floor at the heart of Documenta. Next slide. Yeah, he really brought artists from all over the world. The late Victor Grippo, he passed away on the way to Documenta, but so also each artist really got space in a room, and he wanted it deliberately being in white cubes, being on the same level than how you would experience an artist at MoMA or in one of the grand museums around the world. He wanted to inscribe them in the canon, juxtaposed to their peers who might be more known, who might be acknowledged by Western art history. And he said, we have a lot of work to do to actually gear up and inscribe those important figures into this grander narrative. Next slide. Also, of course, Okwui doesn't think small. So we really embarked also on projects with artists that they otherwise couldn't do. For example, also the late on Kawara, he had like one project reading 1 million years past and future. So we had over the whole period of this 100 days, 500 volunteers who would read in parallel, one into the future, one into the past over the whole course of the time. So he wanted to give artists also the platform of works they otherwise cannot realize, because a documenta actually can do that. Next slide. Derek, yeah. He invited complete exhibitions, The Late Constant, New Babylon. We invited the entire show from Witte de Witt actually into Documenta. We had multiple entire shows, Alan Sekula's Fish Story, Farid Amali from two. He said, no, we have to show the whole context, the grand narrative of each of these shows, the dimension of those shows, the significance of those shows to bigger audiences, because maybe they have not seen by so many. They should be seen by many. The next slide. Yeah, so you would see like a whole show dedicated to one artist. So you can imagine the scale of this documenta, but also the scale of his ambition. Because he said like, we have to turn art history around, and we have to turn around how they feed into politics. For example, Constant New Babylon, of course, came out of the aftermath of World War II. They came out in the discussion of 1968. So he always placed the works in their wider political narrative. Next slide. The late David Goldblatt from South Africa, they became friends when he did the Johannesburg Biennial. And it was the first time David actually would do a color photography series combined with poetry. And so he also encouraged artists to go beyond their comfort zone, trying something new. And it was amazing to have all of these artists present and have this debate with the artist over several years. He really started very early. We meet all the artists multiple times and really embed them in our wider discussion. It was not a selection of artists, it was really forming this documenta together. Next slide. Yeah, Bodhi Ising Kingelis. His imagination of a new Manhattan city in the aftermath, actually, of 9/11. 9/11 just happened shortly before Documenta, and we were very careful how we would relate to this, and leaving it mainly out and just juxtaposing, saying this is the platform, this is the context on which we embark now. The world has changed also after 9/11, not just after COVID. And I think he also paid a tribute. What would be an African artist imagine as a new architecture for Manhattan? Next slide. Yeah, here we see Binding. He wanted to have a very big space. Like he said, we cannot be in small spaces. We need a big space. We want to have the audiences seeing artworks. We don't want to have them just seeing themselves. Next slide. So really shortly, we literally had 3 months to get this building going. You see on the right how it looked before, and on the left how it looked then. He wanted to have a small city. You walk through the exhibition spaces, go out, like artists would be neighbors. There would be clashes. There would be dialogues across countries, narratives, etc. And we embarked on this with a very, very young architecture firm, then Kuhn Malvesi Architects, who since then have built a lot of art institutions. But they would also have their office next to our curatorial office, going over all of this with us, being again embedded. Next slide. Yeah, and in Binding, again, he wanted to unfold basically this narrative. You have here Yinka Shonibare's gallantry and criminal conversation about, as you see, beheaded figures out of the French Revolution. And then in the back, Watara Watts, Untitled. So he wanted also to bring this kind of like wider narratives into the context. I mean, Kassel has been the seat also of a king. We forget that. It's not like now this mid-sized small city as it was today. It was really King Wilhelm was residing there up in Wilhelmshöhe, where we had the work of Stan Douglas. Next slide. And I end with that slide because I mean, there's a lot to tell, but also here, George Adiakpo, explorer and explorers confronting the history of exploration, theater of the world. what he did actually, he commissioned George to reflect on Documenta and do it from his perspective. And he depicted Documenta's history, how usually African history is depicted. So it would unfold Harald Seemann's Documenta 5, and so like through this narrative, but from the perspective of Benin, of his context. And I will end there. And just to say, and as Franklin also did, for him to really invite a wider audience to understand art is not just for the art's sake. Art is embedded in our everyday, in the history of our time, and even the contemporary. We will not understand if we don't put the contemporary in a historical perspective. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ute. I have a couple of questions. Sorry, Terry, to hold you for one more minute. Well, first of all, in Documenta, obviously, you see emerging a series of strategies and topics that really cut through the entire career of Okwui, and also that remain incredibly influential today. The idea of the platforms, it was the first Documenta that was deterritorialized, as then Caroline Christoph Bakargiev did by staging part of Documenta in Afghanistan, or Adam Chinchik by staging an entire parallel exhibition in Athens. So this idea of expanding or somehow deprovincializing Europe, or provincializing Europe, not to show that Europe is a partial point of view, was a crucial axis throughout his work. The idea of the documentary, I think we should return to that question. You know, the idea of images as sites of truth and questions of truth was very important there, and it was already addressing insight. I was rereading the essay that Octavio and Okwui wrote for the Google, I'm sure, which is extraordinary, really. And they talk about the camera as a place where notions of veracity are constructed, and that was a preoccupation of his. And in fact, the only job he had in New York was with the International Center for Photography, and where he did great shows around the notion of the reportage, around the notion of the documentary. And in the use of Onkawara's soundtrack, I think there is a kind of premonition for the arena in Venice. Now, this idea of music and theater even as a central aspect of his choreographies, which I think is also often forgotten, you know, because of the role of politics in his work. We tend to think of his shows as political statements, but Okwui was an extraordinary choreographer of exhibitions, and you know, the way he used Onkawara, the way he used the arena with the live music, he was very theatrical. I don't know if you would recognize that, but, and I know Terry also, you'll speak to that in a second. So the two questions I wanted to ask you are, Ute, one, how do you explain actually the success that Okwui had in Germany and in the German-speaking world, even before Documenta? Now, the short century actually originates in Munich, and sadly, his last job was, his last museum job was in Munich. And obviously, Documenta gave him a platform in Germany. But how and why do you think his ideas were received in the German-speaking world even more warmly than they were in New York to a certain extent, or institutionally more?
I think this has to do with World War II. I mean, with Germans' history embedded in fascism, and I think we are brought up, and Okwui always enjoined that we can never separate politics, art, literature from the wider narrative of what happened during the fascist regime, during the Nazi regime in Germany, and how many intellectuals and critical thinkers, academics, but also LGBT communities, Sinti Roma, have been wiped out. And I think he enjoyed that. And I think Germany enjoyed that he would also make these connections. He would unfold a wider narrative. He allowed us also a point of entry to other geographies and how they are embedded. And I mean, as you mentioned, the short century in the documentary, the short century already would juxtapose works of art with footage from the independence periods and moments across Africa. Like you would have newspaper clippings, but you would also have Fela Kuti albums, so he would set the wider context, these grander narratives. And I think that goes very well in Germany, because I think also if you see shows that happen in Europe, and you can also say in France, or also Catherine David, they open up to a wider contextuality. And he always said he is so grateful to Germany to give him this opportunity, to really be who he is in his complexity as an intellectual, as an organic intellectual, as Gramsci would call it.
Well, thank you. So Terry, take it away. How did you meet Okwui and when?
Okay, so it's wonderful to be here, and Ms. Milano, you're doing a great job with these terrific colleagues who have kind of set already a scene of Okwi's early years and his trajectory through, Franklin brilliantly connecting the early years with the show that's about to be shown at the New Museum, and also taking us into Documenta, which was a wonderful thing to see. So Okwui and I actually met as part of a team of 11 curators working on different parts of global conceptualism. So Louis Kamnitzer, Rachel Weiss, Jane Farber, late Jane Farber, brought us together to try and put together an argument that conceptualist work was created all over the world, not just in New York and Europe, and spread out from there. They wanted to sort of turn that story upside down. With the show at the Queen's Museum in 1998, 99. So we met just before at Bard College. And it was kind of immediately obvious that Okwui, he'd just come from the Johannesburg Biennale. He didn't want to squeeze African artists into a notion of conceptualism that was, as it were, foreign to the circumstance. He said, of course, artists such as Willem Bischoff, working with sort of Braille imagery and language, do fit the model in a way. But African art has always been deeply conceptual in crucial ways. And Franklin mentioned Brulu Boabe. I mean, so we already have artists deeply immersed in languages, inventing languages and seeing the world conceptually. So he was trying to expand the notion of conceptualism in a way beyond even that of the rest of us. And it was quite stunning to hear him being very clear about a key idea, but giving a kind of crucial African perspective. And so that's in a way, one of the great things I learned from him was that it's not that there's Europe and the rest of the world, or Western, non-Western. There's Westism that people from countries outside Europe adopt from the West, but a more authentic sense of nationality or place or continent, a kind of critical sense of, in his case, being African, was a crucial driver. And to me, it parallels our Australian perspective as Antipodeans. We see ourselves as Antipodeans, not as colonized Englishmen and so on and so, or Irish or whatever it happens to be. So these things connect in crucial ways. So I think that his perspective helped me understand the contemporaneity of different world cultures, major world cultures, working with and against each other, often against each other like geological plates shifting at different rates throughout the world. And to see race in the same way, racial disconnection operating in this way as well. And I mention that as an analogy because we've got a sort of world historical perspective here. It's not just the perspective of modernity, which he also taught me and insisted. Modernity always began with colonizing Africa, began all the colonies. And actually, European modernity began with exploitation, and then Europe grew from that. It didn't grow in Europe and be exported. It was the other way around. And these are sort of fundamental you know, if you like, the geopolitical forces and movements. And if I had to say one thing about his curatorship, it would be that he actually made these world forces, made them visible in exhibitions, showed how artists actually took them as a material and how crucial artists thought about them and showed how they operated as were inside us as individuals. And that kind of is the core thematic of much of his work. So just to, if I could show some images to kind of illustrate this point. Okay, so let's go forward. How do we move this guy forward? There we go, okay. So just an image to evoke an earlier moment, not all the way back to global conceptualism, but a kind of important discussion that we were at a few years ago. He's holding the floor here and making jokes, but making very serious points, as you can see. But what I want to focus on is the way in which he, like Uta said, he could do what all the best curators could do. He could pace aesthetic pleasure throughout some rooms, the rooms that he happened to be curating, could pace your aesthetic pleasure. He could introduce much lesser known artists, and give them a central place for viewers, and he could show us new kinds of art. Many curators, including those who I'm sharing this panel with, do that kind of thing all the time and do it very well. But he also took on this larger task, and as I just said, it's kind of to manifest in a visceral way for each viewer the essential reality of what it's like to undergo the experience of these geopolitical transformations, particularly those that have been occurring since the Second World War. And that kind of drives through how he organizes the exhibitions. And he also does it in a way that is both, if you like, world historical. It's kind of a kind of dialectical materialism, but it's also profoundly, has a profoundly kind of level of emotional intelligence. And here, for example, in this room, off the main arena in Venice, where we've been hearing, you know, the Capitol being read to us over and over, you know, throughout the whole exhibition. On the Kiev, the first key room off to the right, when you leave that space, was devoted to world views, world picturing by three women artists. Ellen Gallagher on the walls, where she imagines a kind of black Atlantis. In the center, Homer Barber. It's a kind of atlas figure, a sort of male figure, distended rubber from tires. And then her kind of creatures in the center, her kind of godlike, goddess-like creatures in the center. But in the far background, there's a major painting by the Australian Indigenous woman artist, Emily Enwezors, called Earth Creation, which is literally the creation of the earth by the ancestor figures through her own body, displayed across the land in which she lived. Incredible conjunction of work by three women, essentially rethinking the world on a huge and very important scale. And similarly, when we look at exhibitions such as post-war, it wouldn't have surprised us to come into the first spaces and see work by Joseph Beuys. It did surprise us to have the interview with Hannah Arendt. It wouldn't have perhaps not also surprised us, although I was very glad to see these Hiroshima panels, because I remember as a very young student in Australia being horrified by these when we had to hide in our shelters, worrying about the nuclear war coming this very soon. So it was great to see these things, but he also did something in this exhibition, if I could just spend a few minutes on this one room, that I think sets up in a way and prefigures grief and grievance in an important sense. So this is a room devoted to nation-seeking form. And it's a series of rooms, and this particular room is devoted to the United States and its effort to seek its form, what Obama would call this perfect union, a long way away from that, as we know. So the imperfect union of the United States, and there are, of course, other countries, particularly right next door, was Indonesia and that area of the world. So you could go from area to area, Africa around the corner. But he did it by the juxtaposition of key works, as you see by the Jasper Johns work in the middle, is one of the rare works where Johns took on black imagining of the American flag and did a kind of reversal work. This is a painting in which you can actually see the red, white, and blue flag if you move quickly from dots inside the flag on top and absent flag down below. Very strange work. Similarly, the Whitten work I'll show you in more detail in a minute, and of course the Warhol Birmingham race riots. So one way of actually showing, how do you show historical violence? How do you show the embedded violence of racism, the structural violence of racism? How do you exhibit that? That's in effect the challenge you're taking in the exhibition you're about to mount. But in this case, he did it by the juxtapositions of works by white and black artists, did it also by simple devices of putting historical material up, just reminding people about what the actual historical context was, but also by taking you into the artworks that are about the experience, actual being there. In this case, Whitten, Birmingham, Alabama, where he's got an image of the dogs attacking a demonstrator embedded inside materials from Birmingham, Alabama, as if it's happening on the street surface itself. And similarly, when you go to the other side of the room, he shows us two paintings about white supremacism. As you see on the left, what's the arsehole of the country? It has to be one that's Alabama. And on the other side, Larry Rivers, the death of the last Confederate soldier. But he's juxtaposed that with a work by an Australian Aboriginal artist that I showed him, and he was delighted to include. This is a bark painting by an artist who's had his first aeroplane experience traveling from the remote north of Australia to Sydney Harbour, which you see on the right, and look at all the lands and as it were, the empty lands he doesn't know of people, the peoples who live in that enormous part of Australia. So this is an Indigenous picturing of what it is to be in place and understand the relationship between places. And of course, the room was completed by works that were works from Africa, works about the contradictions and political activity. Women on the left, the work by OKK, women demonstrating by burying their breasts at a certain point, and then the more fantastical imagery on the other side. So he's bringing the United States, if you like, back to a kind of African root. So sorry to go into such, well, not sorry, it's important to go into such detail because this is the specifics of his vision. Also with Katie Siegel, who I hope is listening. Katie was a key advisor in the show, and I'm sure she had a role in organizing this room as well. But what it highlights is the idea that nations don't have essential histories, and they don't have structures like America First. Literally, nations nowadays are in transition. Nationality is in transition. Connections between nations, internationality is in kind of transitions. And he's one of the very few people to be able to see that and to see that artists are grappling with that, and I think to articulate that in his exhibitions. Okay, so there's my thoughts. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Terry. You know, actually on the occasion of that panel that you show a picture of, I think I teased Okwui by saying that what I learned from his shows, and particularly I mean, he hadn't done post-war yet, but the short century, less so than in Documenta and in Venice, but was this idea of including materials and artworks, regardless in a sense of any acknowledgement of their quality. I don't want to sound dismissive in any sense, but the idea that really struck me was that the inclusion of the artworks was less based on any kind of license of beauty or importance or significance, but more as traces of cultural transformations or of biographical adventures. So the idea that the artwork and also the variety of artworks, no, or the object, like the magazine cutout and then the painting and then the video, they all contributed to capture a narrative that was both individual and historical, regardless of acquired notions of taste or acquired notions of propriety. And I think that was, in a sense, one of the most revolutionary contribution of his, and one that we see now more and more common. Even, you know, the most recent rehanging of MoMA, in a sense, celebrates more that approach to art history rather than a series of trophies or a series of licenses of importance. Now, so I don't know if you ever had a conversation with him about how he chose also this variety of materials, varieties of intensities, and as we see here now, a vitrine with magazines and paintings, and all treated somewhat equally, and to learn more about history.
Mr. Limiano, I'm going to have to challenge you there, because you're kind of implying that there's a framework of, as you didn't want to say quality, but you're kind of implying that there are some works that you wouldn't necessarily include in a post-war in a show. So I'll just, an experience that I had. I mean, Okwui and I visited a number of times during this period. Rosalie happened to be visiting. Here's just an image to remind us of who we're talking about. But just to go back to works like this, and even to works like, see, works like this, you could say that if you took each work in the post-war show, and there are hundreds of works in that show, if you wanted to, I mean, I can remember some walls in which there was a Dikudi next to some works by certain artists from North Africa. And you could put the two together, and you could get the sense that one of the artists, such as, in this case, Marwell, small work, it's being included for some token reason, because it's an Aboriginal work. But if you think a little more clearly about this space, it actually doesn't fit. It doesn't fit a narrative, the kind of narrative you're suggesting. He would have, and in fact, we stood before a number of works in this exhibition, which I instinctively thought, these are not very strong. How can you possibly put up a tiny little, relatively small little bark painting next to these big paintings, you know, big in your face, very clear paintings. Neither of which, if you did a whole show of Larry Rivers, you'd probably include this, but Larry Rivers is not the greatest artist of the period. I mean, you know, within the framework of 10th Street painting is okay and whatever. But that kind of criteria is so much less important than what he's trying to argue for. He's trying to argue that in the case, say, of the Marwell painting, which is a painting by the senior elder of the Yolngu people, who are the greatest survivors of the white onslaught of Australian Aborigines you can imagine. Here's an artist from that culture at a point where his land is being taken over by a mining company, envisaging or trying to understand how white people might see their own world, how they might see it connected and not connected. And one thing that's operating in this work is that each of those empty spaces is a potential tribe or a potential people. And all the hatching and lines in between is about their potential connection. And it's about bringing remote parts of Australia on the left together with the settled parts on the right, Sydney Harbour. In other words, the more you look at works like this, which on the face of it don't look like much, they actually establish grounds of quality and judgment that push aside and put away the instinctively Western ones that we have. So that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah. And I mean, just to clarify, that's what I meant. What I found always inspiring by him was how the variety of materials he included in the shows help questions assumptions around taste and around quality, and I think that has been one of his greatest contribution. Obviously, I want to continue the conversation by asking Franklin a question. Has to do also with the work you're doing at the Paris. You have created an institute for I don't remember what's the exact title, for Caribbean
Cultural Institute.
And as we've seen in Ute's presentation, the Caribbean had a place, a prominent place in Documenta, and I found also in Okwi's imagination, I dare to say, almost had a kind of mythical place because of also his interest in the work of Glissant, in the work of Stuart Hall, and I'm just curious if you, first of all, ever had a chance to talk about the Caribbean with Okwui, or if you ever felt that he could be an inspiring figure to understand, or what do you think he saw in that context?
Well, absolutely, and would have loved to see more exhibition presentations in that regard. But the convening for Documenta, right, around Creolite, this space, this expansive space that we can think about in so many different ways, precisely because there has not been a focus, is something that I took. And the conversation that we had revolved around the context of New Orleans. And I was working on an exhibition there, 2013-14. We ended up honoring Okwui as we opened that exhibition. But a large part of that show is dedicated to a conversation around the Caribbean space as being a place for thought, and a place where there is I hate to say the word optimism, but an optimism that is there precisely because there has not been this focal point. And of course, it goes back, as has been noted, in his relationship to literature, his relationship to Stuart Hall, that conversation comes out of or develops from the Black Atlantic, and from a really a place where there's so many ideas that he could explore and did explore in the in-between space between Africa and the quote-unquote New World, or New York, where he settles. So I think there's a lot of substance there to still even look at beyond that.
And since you mentioned New Orleans, in New Orleans you staged an exhibition about Basquiat and the myth of the South, to oversimplify. And I know Okwui was also very interested in the way you read Basquiat. One of his last texts is actually a piece about Basquiat in the retrospective catalog of the Shoah the Arnaud Foundation. And again, I'm curious if you had a conversation about Basquiat. I was, through your work, in a sense, you made apparent how Basquiat was a political artist while being a extremely joyful or sensual or rhapsodic artist, and that unfortunately is often absorbed not as a political artist nowadays. And so I'm curious if you had, and his essay actually in that catalog, I think is titled, he discusses mourning in the work of so he intersected very much with the current show.
That's right. We did talk a little bit about that, because one very specific show, it was a show within a show, was Basquiat in the Bayou. And in fact, that is the same piece we had in that exhibition, the procession piece. It's amazing to see in the catalog. I can't wait to see it in person. but yeah, you could not, you had to get around Bosca in a way, with the background that he was coming from. You had to work your way through that, especially being at New York and being in New York and seeing in that moment the way that that artist or that work was treated versus I think the new meanings that have been ascribed now in the present and through a lot of intellectually rigorous work that has come about since his passing.
And Ute,
Absolutely.
there is actually a question from the audience about whether during the platforms, was there any research also that was done on the artist in the various cities where the platforms took place? I mean, could you say that the platforms also served as actual artistic research, or they were more intellectual seminars?
I would say it's the opposite. It was actually the artists who brought us to these locations. I mean, St. Lucia, for example, is where Isaac Julian is from, and to really connect to Franklin. Isaac, again, also is very influenced by Stuart Hall, and then, of course, Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon going from Martinique, joining the Pan-African movement, the Pan-African liberation movement. So, and these artists in their practice have this. Isaac Julian did a film also on Frantz Fanon, and he worked then on Derek Walcott, Nobel laureate, who is also from St. Lucia and actually has for the first time Creole as a language in his novels. So we were guided by the artists. You know, so the conversations that we had with artists and that Okwui had also prior with artists would bring us to these locations and discourses. It's not the other way around. I think that needs to be understood. And I think the people we involved were also people who came also in the context of the artists. And I think the discussions, for example, he had with Steve McQueen, if we look up Western Deep, and which later I would say is a lead to Hunger and to other works also by Steve, and also the discussion on racism Okwui had with many of his peers. And then how does this link to independent movements, to the Black Atlantic? So for me, I would say it was for all the participants, and it was a lot if you take all the artists, speakers. We were sometimes criticized as it's being an intellectual seminar. Yes, it was. It was for all of us a journey, and we all were very privileged to be part of that. So no, there was no separation of anything. Everything has been kind of embedded in each other, informing each other. And I think what he wanted to do, he wanted to separate the discourse, that it doesn't overshadow the exhibition in Kassel. In Kassel, he wanted to give the entire platform to the art and the artists.
I would like to see if there are questions from the audience, because it's always so strange to do these conversations without seeing who is here with us. And there is a comment rather than a question about how Okwui, even just moments before the press conference at Documenta, said that for him, it was probably the short century, the exhibition that would be remembered for. I don't know if that you agree with it, but I just wanted to pass on this message and encourage any question if.
Max, I just wanted to say one thing, just piggybacking on what Ute said. It's such an interesting and beautiful contrast in that, yes, there is this faith in the artist that was an integral part of the curatorial practice, right? And you can see that in terms of, okay, I'm gonna make this huge part of this biennial project dedicated to performance, or this huge part of this big exhibition is going to actually take place in 4 different places before it even opens. These kinds of things that are about process and about experience are so integral to the curatorial enterprise. But then when you look at it in contrast to that amazing image that Terry showed of those 3 pieces from Indiana to the Australian artist whose name I'm forgetting, to Larry Rivers, right? And to say, yeah, Larry Rivers, okay, it's an okay piece, but what that piece does in the context of that wall is it gives it life that it never even had. And that, I think, is the curatorial innovation expertise. Like we've talked about it in the context of a big conversation around curatorial exhibition making, and it's just so apparent when you look at those kind of two modes of working.
So we are getting a few questions, sorry to intercept. Well, one question is if there is any curator you see at work today that you think is carrying Okwi's work forward. And then
I think just Okwui would laugh about this, and I think we should laugh about this, because I think it's very important to give the confidence to everybody. When I think what is really stunning with Okwui is like he didn't come from a curatorial education program. He studied political science. He has a background in poetry, but he had something to say. So, and he wanted to interfere. And for him, I mean, we often discussed, otherwise maybe he would have been a politician. He adored Kofi Annan, and he was always looking into the realm of the politics. And you mentioned theatricality. Politics is a field of the theatrical. So, you know, so he saw in the art a world where he could address his political concerns with other means. And I think this is what I would say, if there is somebody who would follow Okwui, I hope it's many, it's not just one, and really reflect on what does art really do, and what does the space of the curatorial contribute to resonate and expand what basically the artworks do, but then what we bring in as a discourse, and then share this with a wider group of participants rather than a passive audience.
And Terry, maybe I'll ask you a question about this too.
Yeah.
Since you worked with him as an editor, what were his sources of inspiration or the materials that he read? And maybe it's a question for all of you, because also you have worked with him in various ways, frankly, also as an editor of his own writing. So I'm curious, where did you think that he got his materials or his ideas or inspirations, and what did he read and how?
Okay. Well, a quick comment on the previous question. It would be the wrong thing to do to name one or two inheritors, because Okwui, let's hope that we're beyond the star curator moment in the history of curating. And one of the things Okwui did was encourage and train and work with and really put the squeeze on younger curators who work with him to become more adventurous and to grow and to learn and to just discover that being a curator means you do everything from, you know, the nails to the grandest concepts. And I'm sure Franklin can talk about that in more detail. But so just to make that point. And another one is reading. Obviously, he read Marx. He even read Hegel. He read all the great European theorists. He was totally conversant with the entire range of post-colonial writing from Fanon onwards, and profoundly so for the post-colonial show, which is upcoming, which when we spoke about it many years ago was really to be a show that celebrated the kind of Paul Gilroy's insights, you know, the creation by Black intellectuals around the world of a whole incredibly rich new perspective about what the world is and was and could be. But when you asked me the question, what came to mind most strongly was not so much text, because he did read a huge amount, but the collection of magazines of photographers, illustrated photo magazines from Africa that he had in the, you know, his house in Brooklyn. And he constantly drew on as an archive, going back to that short century question. It was that kind of source, you know, he just accumulated vast amounts of information. Particularly, it's like a Georges Ariagbo as an archivist, you know, a curator who collects this extraordinary amount of discursive material. the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of it wasn't just text or writings. It was actually the work of visual artists, photographers, the perceptions of the world and the understanding of the world that visual artists were working on and working through. That, I think, I mean, I presume it is for all of us in this room, but that's I think the main inspiration, to try to pick out the texture of the historical flow, to make that the flow of images, to pick out the big picture within the flow of images being produced today and in the recent past. And that's, I think, the main inspiration, I would say.
If I might just put in there, I think it's also the deep curiosity that he had. I mean, he why he read all of this, and so, and he I mean, the network he had of people. I mean, we always, each of us only knows a fragment, and then comes a complete other group of people. He was also very closely involved. So the immense curiosity, what everybody does, from political scientists, from academics to journalists to artists, the capacity of absorbing information and then putting it together and then wanting to challenge it. I think that was such a driver. Like, he wanted to challenge these narratives. And I think this enormous drive, I mean, the day couldn't be long enough. And so when he had in Venice all the world's futures, he meant it. You know, he was thinking on that scale. And I just saw now in the list, I quickly had a chance to look on the list of participants. There are so many people who had been involved in the project, in Documenta, in other projects. And he also drove us further. I mean, at least for me, I can say that. So if there's the question, like, who inherits this, I think everybody who worked with him in a certain way, because he really pushed the boundaries, and we pushed, hopefully, our boundaries.
There are a couple of more questions. Sorry, because it's a little one, which is, can members of the panel comment on whether they recall Okwui Enwezors discussing the issue of epistemic authority with the context of his curatorial work and his work as a scholar activist around the world? I'm interested because so often curators and other cultural producers of color have an ongoing struggle that means we have to overprove our credentials within a Western curatorial context. And it's coming from Carol Ann Dixon. So I don't know if any of you has a answer on it.
I would just only follow with the clarity of vision of what he produced and what he wanted to say. And it does beg the question of how do you, curatorially see that working within the field, because he was hyper aware. And I just think of 1997, for instance, and if you think about that being one of those years where we have Münster sculpture project in Venice and Documenta all happening at the same time, that year you also had a fifth project of Istanbul with Rosa Martinez. You had Gwangju with Harold Zeman, and even Lyon with the same curator. I think he was hyper aware about every single one of those exhibitions and knew that he was not going to do anything remotely like them. And there's so much to learn just from looking at that trajectory moving forward.
I just want to add, I mean, it's the exclusion and only the peripheral injection in homeopathic doses of curators of color. And I mean, in my time when we met, of women, now that has changed. But he was very aware of that, and it made him furious. And I think that was another concern of him until his passing, about the increasing nationalism and racism that returned. And I think America concerned him greatly under Trump, and he was very fearful for his daughter. In which world will she grow in as a Black woman? And I think this notion of inequality that continued, and the racial bias that continues in the world, he was very furious about that. And I think he was also often furious about his peers who would also not stand up enough. This is why Horace Winker also was a speaker, because Horace Winker said, like, we are in Africa, we always accept this, what Terry said, the Western kind of like narrative as our guiding principle. We are enablers too, coming from Africa. So it needs a wider debate. And I think that was what he was deeply engaged with, also with post-colonialism. Post-communism was a next one to follow, the post-war. So to really understand this needs an effort from the whole world, not just from one part of the world.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Mr. Lemiano, there's a key phrase in the introduction to the Grief and Grievance catalogue. After the example that Franklin reminded us of, you know, the ridiculous spectacle of Trump at Gettysburg trying to convince us that he inherited the spirit of that place in some sense. Okwui has this phrase, the normalization of white supremacy, the way in which it's becoming normalized in the United States during the past 4 years. We saw what that leads to, you know, on January the 6th. And let's hope that that was its premature ejaculation, and it'll have spent itself, or a lot of itself, but probably not. So I think, I mean, none of us could have predicted that moment, but in a way, the shift within the United States, the reactionary resurgence throughout the world against what had previously seemed to be an empowering and a growth of transnational transitionality, or the second world, third worlds, fourth worlds, them coming to occupy the world centers. The reaction against that is the situation that we're in. He could see that. So that's why I spoke about having a dialectical materialist perspective through the whole trajectory of his thinking. And obviously you can't make every show about such a large concept on such a big scale, but in a way Documenta was about, 11 was about that. And in a way, you know, going back to short century, trade routes, all the world's futures post-war, the post-war project was the closest anyone in curating has ever got to setting the context and giving us some sense of the lineaments, you know, the lineaments of these dialectically materialist historical movements of the world, I think. So that's what I most appreciate about what he tried to do. Anyway.
Well, there was a question about how you see his work would have reacted to the current resurgence of populism and nationalism, and I think you have all addressed. I think we're also running a little late. One question which is very bittersweet is from somebody who said didn't have the pleasure of meeting Okwui, and if you want to share any anecdote or any personal note, I don't know if you want to end on that personal note. It might be too bittersweet, but I think it's also time to say goodbye. So I don't know if any of you want to remember fondly Okwui with some special memory. Probably too many, but
I think we have.
I think if you read what he wrote, you get a sense of him. So I think what I think is, of course, we mourn his loss, but I think I'm also, he left so much, you know, like to engage with. So in that way, he's not gone. You know, his writing is there. Now the show is opening, then Sharsha works on a big project. So he gave us a lot to do. So he's not gone. He kept us busy, or keeps us busy. So if you really want to learn about him, and so there is so much out, he wrote so much, the books, they're like catalogs. And to take that spirit, because he took the spirit from others, you know, so I think it's, yeah, it's always a sad thing to lose somebody, but I think we should rather concern what did these people leave us and what did he leave us with? And he leaves us with a lot of work to do.
Mm. So maybe I'll add, this is, that question takes me back to the last 6 days before he died, when Louise Neri, his partner, and I, and many friends, and some who couldn't make it there, were in Munich. And so what we saw was the inevitable physical decline of a life force, a certain, someone who had enormous energy, enormous physical energy, as you said, and but also enormous intellectual, not just curiosity, but grasp, synthetic imagination, a way of being able to bring together in a way, all the world's contradictions, all the world's contradictions with always an optimism about its future, no matter what was going on. So that's was manifest in all sorts of small ways, which we don't go in, no point in going into, but it was manifest, I think, in all his work. It's so it's a kind of courage and energy and an insistence that we grapple with the contradictions that were of being human and of our divisions, and keep generating a place for those who have been excluded and those who are repressed. And it's hard, I can't go on anymore, so I'll stop. Okay.
Thank you so much. I don't know. Thank you very much for coming together to celebrate Okwi's work, and I hope to see you all soon in person again, and thank you for all the viewers. And as Ute say, Okwui left us many gifts and a lot of work to do. So the least we can do to honor his memory is to keep on working. So thank you so much.